morning I want to speak to you. Maybe it's something that I'd spoken about many years ago, because I put a date next to a sermon that I've preached, and I think this was probably done 15 years, 16 years ago, but I just felt I needed to speak about this again, because people are struggling with stuff in their lives. And there are so many new people as well. And what I want to speak about this morning is God enough for you, even without all the answers? This whole sermon is going to be about Job, the suffering, the question about why do godly people suffer? How come? And I want you to understand, this is not the wealth gospel. Come to Jesus and everything is fine for the rest of your life and nothing's going to happen to you, because that's not true. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to kind of just look at some of the first chapters and then some of the very last chapters and kind of bring this thing together. And then afterwards, this is what I'm going to do, just to warn you in advance. I'm going to ask for a response. If you want to be prayed for this morning, at the end of the service, I'm going to ask you to come to the front. Just stand here. And then after that, I'm going to ask for those who feel like they can pray and want to pray for those who are standing here. And so if you want somebody to pray with you after this morning, please feel free to come. It's time to be ministered to. It's just one of those things. There's a story for you. A very good story, old story. Very long time ago now, a certain rabbi came to a town and wanted to spend the night there. Very long time ago, okay? This is before cell phones and cars and all that kind of stuff. The town people, of course, hated Jews, and nobody wanted to take them into their home. So the rabbi went into the nearby woods to spend the night there with his donkey, with his rooster, and with his lamp. We've got lots of roosters running around here. So he lit his lamp and opened up the Holy Scroll so that he could study for the evening. But as he was studying, the wind came up and blew over his lamp, breaking it in the process. All the light is gone. He couldn't study anymore, but he said to himself, all that God does, he does well. Then he decided it's time to go to bed. While he was sleeping, thieves came in the night, stole his rooster, stole his donkey from underneath his nose. And when he woke up the next morning, he said, where are they? They've been stolen. And this is what he said, all that God does, he does well. The next morning he went then back into the village, but was horrified to see what had actually taken place during the night. See, in the middle of the night, soldiers had attacked the village, killing all the inhabitants and plundering the small village. Nothing was left. He also learned that the soldiers had passed through the exact point where he was camping out in the woods that specific night. And as he started to think about all of this, he said, if my lamp had been burning, the soldiers would have seen me. If my rooster would have crowed, or my donkey would have brayed, they would have gotten me. And then he bowed his head before God and he said this, all that God does, he does well.
Amen.
I'm going to refer back to the story right at the end again. I think for many people in our world today, the problem that suffering poses has often been one of the most asked questions. In fact, let me tell you this. The problem of people suffering is one of the 7 most objections to Christianity. How can a loving God allow good people to suffer? And so I don't want anything to do with that God. One of the 7 most objections to Christianity. In other words, many people have failed to believe in Jesus just because they could never understand the significance of suffering or why it happens. However, those people who understand suffering know how to respond to it. But the question is this, how do you start seeing suffering as that rabbi did? How do you reach that place in your life where you can still trust God in the midst of all of your pain and all of your loss and all of your suffering? How can you learn to say, no matter the circumstances, all that God does, He does well? How do you get to that place? I think suffering stirs the deepest emotions and feelings in people. Because pain has often driven all of us to ask the toughest questions about life, about God, and about our faith in Christ. It is in times of great suffering when we start asking questions like, what is the meaning of life if I have to suffer like this? How could God allow this to happen to me and to my family? Why do good people suffer? Have you ever asked questions like that? But you know, I think the truth about suffering is that it actually strips us of everything. When the music fades, and I put down my instruments, is God enough? It kind of opens us up and gets you down to the basics of life. It gets you down to the basics of your faith in Jesus Christ. And so I think the best place to look for an answer is found in the book of Job. In this story, it's probably, we believe it's the oldest book in the Bible as well. In this story, God gives you the insight that pushes you to the limits of your faith in Him. You're not going to find easy answers this morning. I'm just warning you. But I believe there are definite principles that can equip you for life's most difficult challenges that lies before you, even at this moment as you're sitting here. Just a few principles. A principle that I want to share with you. The principle is this. Don't be surprised when suffering comes your way. Don't be surprised. I think many people would say that suffering could be based upon some sort of mathematical formula of cause and effect. If you do that, this is what's going to happen. They say all suffering is because of that. Some people even think that suffering could be the consequences of certain situations and behaviors in our life. But the truth is, suffering is very mysterious. It's pretty mysterious because it comes to all people and to all people in all walks of life at all different kinds of unannounced times. It hits the super spiritual person, and you know what? It also hits the non-believer. It hits the rich man, the poor man. It hits the children, the older people. It hits successful people and unsuccessful people. In other words, there are no exemptions. Everyone is included. Everyone. And so the story of Job confronts you with this exact mystery right from the start. We see that Job is a model parent. I mean, he does everything according to the scriptures. Brilliant. He does everything according to the scriptures. He's a model parent, and he's a model of his faith in God to the people around him. In fact, right from the beginning, you quickly learn that Job was a man of great integrity, a man of great faith, great biblical values. And so the book begins with a description of a godly man and his family. And you would ask the question, now why? Why did God choose him? It's the question. So let me just read you. It's not on the screen. I just want to read. Otherwise, we're going to have too much on the screen. Listen to chapter 1. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God, stayed away from evil. And I think you would say he's doing the right thing. Right, absolutely. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He also had many servants. In other words, God had blessed him. Many things. He was, in fact, the richest person in the entire area. Job's sons would take turns preparing feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to celebrate with them. When these celebrations ended, sometimes after several days, Job would purify his children. Why? He would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. For Job said to himself, perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular practice. I mean, come on. He is a model believer. Right? You agree with me? Absolutely. And so I think you would agree with me that this paints a picture of a very blessed life, and without knowing what was to come, one would have no reason whatsoever to expect bad things to happen to this good, godly man. No reason. But then one day Job gets up, and a disaster strikes him and his family. The first 3 servants bring their devastating report of Job's total financial ruin in one night. Later he finds out that he no longer had any farm animals left, and he no longer had any sheep or camels left. They were all gone. In other words, everything that sustained him and his family financially was taken away from him in an instant. Just like that. In an instant, Job had no more material assets left over that belonged to him. And yet, the worst news was still to come. A 4th servant arrives and says this, and just to read it to you. He comes running to Job and he says, Mr. Job, your sons were feasting in their oldest brother's home. And Job suddenly thinks, well, at least I still have them, but listen to the news. But his servant continues, suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the desert, like a tornado, and hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed, and all your children are dead now. Complete devastation. Question is this: how would you expect Job to react to all of that stuff? But let's get a bit closer to home this morning. What would you do if someone brings you that same report when you return from work tomorrow afternoon? What would you do? Think about it for a moment, and I want you to be honest with yourself. What would you do, and how would you feel about that? It's gone. But what Job does next has left generations of people completely stunned. I want to put that up on the screen. Job stood up, tore his robe. Now he's in grief. Okay? Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground before God. What is he doing? He's worshiping God. Listen carefully. He's worshiping God. And he said this: I came naked from my mother's womb. In other words, with nothing into this world. And I will be stripped of everything when I die. Isn't that true? The Lord gave me everything I had, acknowledges that, and the Lord has taken it away. Now watch what he says. Praise the name of the Lord. Now, would you have responded in the same way? I really think that Job responds to his situation the way that he responds kind of shocks us a little bit. I don't know if I would have responded in that way. Who would have said that after losing everything in one night, that Job would fall down before the Lord and worship? I think I would have cried, I would have complained. Who's the person? Who did this to me? Let me sort him out. Isn't it? This is unfair, God. I would have been upset. But to worship God in this situation, I don't know if I would have done that. But I believe Job had a good sense from where his prosperity had come from, and that is why he could respond in that way. The question to you is this: how does your own attitude towards your own possessions affect your spiritual vitality? See, this hits like a hole in this whole wealth gospel. Come to Jesus, you have all the money in the world. It's not about the money. In other words, let me put this up as well. If someone had to take all of your possessions away from you in this coming week, would you continue to believe that Jesus is good? Yeah, tough one, isn't it? I told you, no easy answers here this morning. But if the book of Job had ended right there, then that would have given many people the right to say, well, You should be like old Job when suffering strikes you. You should never get mad at God. And even if everything in the world goes wrong, you should just worship God, just swallow your pain, take it on the chin, and move on with life. Fortunately, though, the book of Job does not stop there. It goes on. It only starts there. Because this is where the book begins to deal with the questions like, why do righteous people suffer? Have you asked that question? I think what we need to concentrate on here is the word righteous. Why do righteous people, what is righteous? Being right before God. Why do we suffer? You see, the book of Job is not only about evil and suffering in the world. It's not only about why evil happens, because it really focuses on the rather tougher question, why does evil happen to good people like Job? But there is a biblical principle we need to understand this morning. You see, being righteous, being right with God, now here's the shocker, does not mean that you live without sin in your life. We still carry some sin with us, am I right?
Yes.
The Bible says that all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So what we need to take note or take into account this morning is that if you trust God through Jesus Christ, watch this, if you follow Christ as best you know how to, if you truly love God, you will still suffer from time to time, or sometimes all the time. Don't ask me why. Admit it. In other words, being a Christian is no guarantee that you will never suffer in life. But why? Why the suffering then? I know it is one thing for a criminal to be gunned down after killing a person, holding them hostage. I understand that. But what do you make of the pastor and his wife and his children in a small town who were brutally murdered after coming home from church and giving up their lives to preach the gospel in another country? What do you say? What do you make of an old missionary lady being killed by the very people that she's working amongst? You see, the causes for the suffering of the people who love God can never be calculated by any formula known to any person in this world. There is no formula. That's why I think there is a certain mystery about suffering. And so it means that suffering cannot be understood by us from an earthly perspective fully. Some of it we can, but not always. And so now the scene changes. There's a scene I want to speak about quickly that kind of upsets some people. Just listen to the scene. The scene shifts somewhat from Job's earthly estate to a very unusual scene in heaven. Listen to what happens in heaven. Now, I get this. Job doesn't know what's happening. Watch what happens in heaven without Job knowing about it. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan the accuser came with them. It's like, here I come. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. And Satan answered the Lord, I've been going back and forth across the earth, watching everything that's going on. Remember, Satan has been cast down to the earth. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? The Lord says, let me brag about it. In a sense, he's the finest man. This is God's testimony. God's testimony of who Job is. He is the finest man on all the earth. A man of complete integrity. He fears God and will have nothing to do with evil. God's testimony about a good man. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, I hear what you say. Job fears God, but not without good reason. You have always protected him and his home and his property from harm, Lord. You have made him prosperous in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But take everything away he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. So now Satan lays down a challenge to God. God says, I'll take the challenge. All right? You may test him. Test him. Test him. The Lord said to Satan, do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. It's a rather unsettling scene that plays out in heaven without anyone on earth knowing what was discussed in heaven. And I don't think we can fully understand this scene, but I believe we can draw at least two quick lessons. Here's the first lesson when you look at suffering. Listen carefully. There is much going on in life here on earth that we can never know from our finite perspective. You get it? In other words, often we have no idea what is going on in the heavenly counsel of God. And how Satan has access to God is something that we don't fully understand. And why God would point out Job sometimes goes beyond my understanding. Why would God do that? But I think it teaches us that there is something more involved in suffering than just simple cause and effect. In other words, whenever there is suffering, we need to take into account that there are things going on in heaven. In the spirit realm, there are things we never know, even as we would not know about Job's situation, without God helping us a little bit in the book. So here's our problem. When suffering hits us, we often jump to conclusions that only cause us more pain. But this scene clearly shows us that there is more to Job's situation than he or any other human being knows about. Now, I want to give you something, just tell you something, how it works. In this passage, we have a literary feature that is called dramatic irony. Dramatic irony. So now we're busy, this happened thousands of years ago. We're busy reading the story. What I mean by dramatic irony is this, is that you and I know something as we read the story about the reason why Job is suffering while he himself knows nothing. Do you get it?
Yeah.
I want you to get that. What we know, he doesn't know. In other words, as you watch Job in the story, you actually have more information than Job has on his own situation. And then you kind of think, if Job only knew what we know today, he would have acted differently and spoke differently. But he doesn't. And with this comes the second lesson. I put it up as well. When we fail to understand, there are spiritual dynamics and processes we cannot always understand. Then we quickly draw conclusions and we make accusations which cause even greater suffering sometimes in people's lives. Do you know why I say that? Remember Job's friends? Oh, Job, you must have sinned against God. You must have. That's why you're suffering like this. And was that the truth? No. They made their conclusions without knowing what was said in heaven. All three of Job's friends, they all make the wrong assumptions. They make the wrong accusations. And this is exactly why Job's friends' advice makes no sense whatsoever, because they assume that Job is punished for something that he's done wrong, some of the other sin that he's committed. And when Job fails to confess his sins to them, because he says, what have I got to confess? They tell him that he's self-righteous. Get your act together, Job. Go into your house and find out from the Lord where you've secretly sinned, and that's why God is kind of whack you over the head. But in fact, they have no idea what happened in the heavenly council between God and the devil. Have you ever had an experience like that? Has anybody ever told you that you are sick because you have sinned? And you know that you have not? Has anybody ever told you the reason why you were not healed was because you are harboring some unbelief in your heart? I cannot even stop to think how many people have had their faith in Christ destroyed by people who think they know what's happening in another person's life. And many of those people have left the church and they've left God. The question is this: how does Job respond? Because that's where we learn how to deal with suffering. Well, as you will find out from the life of Job, your own expression of hurt and confusion may prepare you for God's touch in the midst of your suffering. In other words, Job's initial response to his calamity is something to learn from. The Lord has given me, the Lord has taken. Praise the Lord. And as the suffering continues to increase in his life, Job then moves into expressing himself before God and questioning God, because now his friends are questioning him. And so he gets to the place in his life that he says, I'm going to ask God, what the heck is happening with me and why? Listen, I'm just going to read it to you. Chapter 7. Job comes to God. He says to God, I cannot keep from speaking. Just imagine how he's fed up. I must express my anguish to you. I must complain in my bitterness to you. Am I a sea monster that you place a guard on me? If I think my bed will comfort me and I will try to forget my misery with sleep, you shatter me with dreams. In other words, you keep me up all night. You terrify me with visions. I would rather die of strangulation than go on like this. I hate my life, Job says. I do not want to go on living. Oh, God, leave me alone for the few remaining days. What are we mere mortals that you should make so much of us? For you examine us every morning and test us every moment. You won't leave me alone, even for a moment. Now watch what he asks. Have I sinned against you? What have I done to you, O watcher of humanity? Why have you made me your target? Am I a burden to you? Why not just pardon my sin and take away my guilt if I've sinned against you? For soon I will lie down in the dust and die. When you look for me, I will be gone. Have you ever had a discussion like that with God? Now, let me tell you, God's not offended when we talk to him like that. He's bigger than us. But this is how Job is feeling. Why me? I think that's kind of more how we would react, am I right? In other words, Job is so tired of his situation that he says, I just want to go to sleep and get away from the pain for a while. But when he lies down, he has a nightmare and he says, thanks a lot, God, I can't even get away from you in my sleep. And I'm tired when I've got to go to work tomorrow and I can't sleep. What the heck is going on? And then he goes on to say, I prefer death rather than staying in this body of mine. I don't want to live anymore. Take my life. Just leave me alone, God, because my days here on earth have no meaning whatsoever. That's the conclusion he comes up with. Have you ever said that to God? Have you ever felt like that? And so there's something you need to take note of here. There is something I want you to pick up this morning. Put it up in the screen for you. You will not be rejected by God in life for expressing your pain. You will not. Some people say, well, I can't tell God how I feel. Well, you can. He's big enough. Because often it is through expressing just that you make ready for God's healing touch to come. That's exactly what David does in the Psalms. He goes so deep. And then God comes and heals him. The story is told of C.S. Lewis, one of the great Christian writers. If you can get some of his books, read it. He was married in 1956 and then suffered the loss of his wife just 4 years later. 4 years. And then he wrote a book about this. It's called A Grief Observed. Listen how he writes in the beginning about his grief, losing his wife. Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But to go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find, he writes? A door slammed in your face. and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that silence, you may as well just turn away and go away, he writes. Can you imagine being so discouraged? You can almost see C.S. Lewis just shutting the door behind him, walking away from God. Fortunately, the book doesn't end there. It only begins there. At the end of the book, he reflects on the many questions on suffering that he has before God. And let me quote again from A Grief Observed. And I quote, "When I lay these questions before God, I get no answer. But a rather special sort of no answer. It is not the locked door. It is more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze. As though he shook his head, not in refusal, but waving the question. Like, peace, child, you don't understand. Can a mortal ask a question which God finds unanswerable, he writes. Quite easily, I should think. All nonsense questions are unanswerable. How many hours are there in a mile? Is yellow square or round, he asks. Probably half the questions we ask about God are like that. End quote. It's interesting, isn't it? In other words, at the end of the day, when all is said and done, you and I will not always have all the answers. You may just catch a glimpse of what it's all about, but often we don't always get the whole story from God. Yes, there are times when God's purposes become clearer to you as you go into that time of suffering or even afterwards, but that's not always the case. I don't know if there have been times in your own life, as in the life of the rabbi, when you were able to look back on your life and see that the lamp that broke and got blown out turned out to be something that protected you anyway. You know what I mean? Have you ever looked back over your life and seen that something you lost helped you find something much richer in life? Yeah. Here's another principle quickly I want to share with you. Don't always expect an answer from God in your suffering. Don't. You know, as much as you may think that God owes you some answers to the things in your life, the fact still remains that you cannot always count on God answering all these things because He's doing something. In this story about Job, God never answers Job's questions. Never does. However, beginning in chapter 38, one of the last chapters, God starts addressing Job. Job has been complaining for 35, 36 chapters. He's been complaining. Why am I? So it goes on the whole time. Why me? Why me? 38, God rocks up. He says, let me ask you some questions, Job. Watch what God asks him. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself, Job, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Now come the questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, Job, if you know so much. Do you know how its dimensions were determined and who did the surveying? What supports its foundations and who laid its cornerstone at the morning, as the morning starts, sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Can you answer me those questions? Now watch this. And God goes on. I'm not going to read them all. He asks about 50 questions to Job. To challenge Job. And God's questions come back and it overwhelms him so much that finally Job comes to his senses. And this is what he says in chapter 40. Watch what he says. Then the Lord said to Job, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic, but do you have the answers? Then Job replied, Let me get back on my knees. I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will put my hand over my mouth in silence. I have said too much already. I have nothing more to say. And in that moment, God becomes enough for Job, even without the answers. In that moment, there's a realization. And God comes to Job with another set of questions. And never once does God speak of the devil. He never tells him what was happening. Just imagine this. God never once tells Job, hey, there was a heavenly council. Let me just tell you what we decided before you even knew what was coming. Never once tells him what had happened. God never tells Job why he suffers. And Job is never even given the information concerning his circumstances. Instead, he is given a revelation of who God is in his situation. And these questions then become God's answers to Job in his time of suffering. And they all serve to remind Job that God is God. That God is the ruler of everything in heaven and on earth. In other words, what God is saying here is that He is the ruler over Job and all of his circumstances. Just trust me in it. You may not understand why it's happened, but trust me. And do you trust me, even if you do not have the answers? The point is this. Suffering is not answered by understanding, but by trusting God. That's a huge thing to get our minds around, isn't it? Suffering is not answered by understanding, but by trusting God in the situation. In other words, you will not always have all the answers to the suffering in your life, but you will always have God. The nearness, the closeness of God. You and I may never understand why things happen in our lives. Only trusting God will carry you through this day and the next day and the next day. And you may never know why things are happening to you, but you can always know that God is with you. Is that enough? Now you may know how the book of Job ends. Eventually, when Job gets through all of this and God's finished with that, God gives him back everything and then some. Obviously not the same children. But He gives him back double. Everything. But Job gets to the end of this knowing more fully who God is and in God who he trusts. Because why? Because for Job, God was enough even without the answers. Happened with me when I broke my leg that day when I was lying there. The first thing I said, and I told you this, the first thing when I lay there, I shouted out to God, why me? Still an hour away before anybody arrived to help me. Why me? And it was a few minutes later, I just rested. Lord, what can I do? What can I do? There must be some purpose. I still don't know the full purpose. I know some of it. I understand some of it. But not everything. The question is, if God had to take everything away from you right now, would God be enough for you to continue with your life with joy and in peace? Is God enough for you even without the answers? Have you been going through a time of suffering lately? Have you also questioned God about things happening in your life and in the life of your family? Has someone actually questioned you while you were in great pain and confusion? The real question is this: is God enough for you even without the answers? And by that I mean, is God enough, or do you always need to and have to have the answers? Remember that Job brought all of his anger, all of his disappointments to God. And by the way, listen carefully, those prayers weren't pretty prayers. And I have prayed not pretty prayers myself. But you have to understand that God is big enough for your questions and all the emotions that go with that. So allow your faith to grow, in God to grow during times of this painful process that you might be going through. But when all is said and done, you will not have all the answers, but you will have God. And God is enough. Enough to comfort you when you mourn, enough peace when you fear, enough assurance when you are doubting, enough courage when you face the unknown in your life. You see why? Because God himself is the answer to your suffering.